Hello everyone, and welcome to my guide for fighting Barioth in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Barioth is one of those new flying wyverns that we got in Iceborne, right? We got Nargacuga, we got Tigrex, and we got Barioth. And he is arguably the most difficult of the three. The reason I decided to make a combat guide specifically for him is because when you're fighting Nargacuga and you're fighting Tigrex, I feel like players generally don't get stuck on those two as much as they get stuck on Barioth. Barioth is especially difficult, and a lot of people consider him the first wall that you run into in the story mode. That can be hard for people who have been playing the game for a long time to kind of grasp and understand, but I at least appreciate it. I played Monster Hunter World, the base game, for the first time just, 2 years ago, and I remember how difficult that was for me because I really didn't understand this game. I especially didn't really understand how to get damage and defense onto my builds, but also how to think of fighting a monster. So this guide is very much not just a guide for fighting Barioth, but an overall guide for understanding how do I approach a fight that's difficult and overcome it. If you find a tip in this guide or a piece of information extremely useful in helping you defeat Barioth, or you just want to help me out, consider leaving a like on the video or leaving a comment or sharing it. It really does make a difference. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Whenever I'm doing something difficult, I try to break it down into smaller parts to help me understand what's going on. That's why when you see a lot of my videos, you'll notice a lot of them are top 10 this, top 10 that. That's because those are lists. Lists are pieces of information that have been broken down, and that's kind of what we're going to start out with here. Here are my best tips for fighting Barioth. Tip number 1, breaking Barioth's parts makes him much easier to fight. Okay, so he's one of these monsters where if you can break his face and you can break his arms, you can also break his back, you can cut his tail, you can break his hind legs. Well, if you can break his parts, he just becomes considerably easier to fight. His moveset changes. That's right, when you break his parts, his moves become easier because they have longer recovery times. You'll find him flopping around when he's trying to shoot that blizzard at you. Sometimes it doesn't even come out. So breaking Barioth's parts early is the key to easily defeating Barioth. Do you understand? Some fights in Monster Hunter World are like this. The monster starts out kind of easy, and then as you progress, he becomes much harder. Barioth is the other way around. He starts out very strong, and then as you break his parts and exhaust him, he becomes much easier. Okay, so he's in reverse. The beginning of the fight is the hardest part of the fight. So that's going to be the leading tip. That brings us right into tip number 2. Barioth is especially weak to being trapped. Okay, you've got 2 types of traps in the game, shock traps and pitfall traps, right? And you can actually craft up to 4 of these, which means you can use 3 of them to just trap him over and over again and hold him in place, and then you save the 4th trap for actually capturing him at the end of the fight. So that's what I'm recommending. You see a lot of experts do this. They bring a shock trap, they bring a pitfall trap, and then they bring the ingredients to craft more traps. You're going to do this with Barioth. You're going to start the fight out, just like I said, he's very strong at the start. You're going to wall splat him, and then you're going to trap him 3 times in a row, and you're going to focus on one body part until that body part breaks. Particularly, I would aim for the face. That's where he takes the most damage, which is exactly what we're going to talk about next for the 3rd tip. Tip number 3 is going to be a brief examination of Barioth's hitzone values. These hitzone values were taken off of the Kuranico website. For those of you who have never seen this before, this is like the better version of the Hunter's Notes. It tells you where to actually attack, and it tells you how much damage a monster is actually taking from your attack type. Okay, so with Barioth, for raw damage, the best place to attack him with all 3 types of raw damage, sever, blunt, and shot, is going to be right on his head. And that's by a lot, so the best place to attack him is definitely on the head. There's a small exception, the tail tip, not the tail tip, will also take pretty good sever damage, so if you're in a situation where you can smack him in the tail with your greatsword, go for it. When we're talking about elemental damage, he takes the most damage on his claws, that's his forelegs, except for when they break. When the forelegs break, the best place to attack them becomes the head again. In fact, you could even argue, if you're using a weapon that does a mixture of good raw damage and fire damage, you would still choose the head, okay? Because the claws really don't get the nice raw hitzone values that the head does. So if you ever watch a speedrunner and he's using dual blades, he will only focus on the head. He won't even touch the wings, despite the wings having better fire damage hitzones. Okay, that's a lot to digest. If you want the too long don't read version of it, simply attack him on the head the whole time. Alright? Break that head as soon as possible. If you happen to break the wings and the forelegs in the process, great. He's going to be even easier to fight at that point. Tip number 4 is about Flinch shotting Barioth. Okay, so Flinch shotting is a skill that you just need to be good at. This is a get good kind of skill, right? But I'm making sure you're aware of it. Some people like to call it the wall splat. It's a pretty funny name in my opinion. Basically, this is when you grab a monster by the head with your clutch claw, and then you press right trigger to fire all of your ammo into the monster's head. This will drive the monster forward and slam him into a wall. You can additionally use a claw attack while you're attached to his head, and when you use a claw attack, this will turn him 90 degrees. So with Barioth, again, the trick with him is all about crowd controlling him as much as you can in the early game. Since a monster can always be flinch shotted in the early game, you want to make sure to get that double flinch shot on him, and you want to make sure that you take the most advantage of it that you can. So soften him up, wall splat him, and then just go nuts on his head and start to try and break his face as soon as possible. This is really going to give you a big advantage. So think about it. Wall splat, second wall splat before he becomes agitated, trap, 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 just like that. It's going to be shock trap, pitfall trap, shock trap. Well, actually, no, I'd do it the other way. I would do 2 pitfalls and 1 shock trap, because the pitfalls, I believe they last slightly longer on the first trap. So all that information is really good. It's all about crowd controlling Barioth very early on while you're trying to get the parts broken on him. Tip number 5 is also a crowd control tip. I'm going to recommend that you try to mount Barioth at least twice. A lot of weapons are quite good at mounting, especially the greatsword and the hammer are really good at this because they deal a lot of damage. When you roll off of a ledge and attack, you do tons of damage. Okay, so I would go for at least 2 mounts throughout this fight. I'm imagining you doing the story mode fight, right? The assignment quest. And if you can get 2 mounts on him, that's 2 more knockdowns. For a new player, that's not going to be the fastest way to fight him. You'll notice speedrunners don't really worry about mounts as much. But for a new player, it's like a safe haven. The moment you got him mounted, you're able to knock him down and get another free knockdown. So now you got 2 wall splats. You got 3 traps that are catching him and having him stand in place, and you're talking about getting 2 mounts that will knock him down as well. That's a lot of crowd control, and all that crowd control is going to make him so much easier in the early game. For tip number 6, I'm going to tell you to not forget your flash pods. Barioth likes to use some pretty powerful attacks, and he likes to fly. When a monster has been flashed, they tend to not ever use their flying attacks, and they tend not to use their strongest attacks. So if you're at a point where you're out of mounts, or it would be hard for you to get another mount, you're out of traps, he's not ready to be wall splatted, just shoot a flash pod at him and watch him kind of flop around for a while and not use any of his most dangerous moves. You could use this as an opportunity to get in there and try to get some free hits on him during the chaos. Tip number 7 is going to be a tip for players who are playing 2-player or single player. You get your Palico, right? Make sure your Palico has the Rattlebond Ball. This is a weapon, a Palico weapon that deals sleep damage to the monster, and it can give you a free sleep on Barioth. In fact, in one of my runs, I got 2 free sleeps. That means you can barrel bomb him as well, okay? And another thing, with the Vigor Wasp spray, if you have that on your Palico, if you keep leveling that up, your Palico will be able to give you 1 free revive. That's also a tip for your Palico. And additionally, when you're at the canteen, you can eat for Feline Moxie. You might need to use a voucher for that, but Feline Moxie will work just like the gut skill, so that if you have a certain amount of health left and the monster attacks you and takes the rest of that health out, you will actually survive with 1 HP rather than dying. All those are good tips for your survivability, but also for getting that wake of attacks with the sleep barrels, right? Tip number 8 is going to be about dodging Barioth's attacks. His easiest to dodge attack is the hip check. This is where he kind of winds up and he just kind of slams his hips into you. You can roll straight into that and you get a nice iframe. The attack frame for that doesn't last very long, so you can dodge right through it. The other thing is when he jumps up in the air, he tends to overshoot you if you just run toward him. Alright, so if Barioth jumps in the air, just run straight for him, and his moves tend to shoot down at an angle. It just goes right over your head. The thing is, with Barioth, what I had the most trouble with when I fight him is kind of similar to Tigrex. He throws his whole body at you. That's what makes Barioth tricky. It's hard to dodge that. It's hard to get away from that in time. And you just have to constantly be moving and maybe ready to dive evade if you have to, or just use a regular evade and try to iframe through it. That is, I think, a big part of the fight that a lot of new players will struggle with. If you're not dealing enough damage, you're going to have to do a lot of evading to avoid those moves. But again, those tricks should help you. Get out of that hip check, and when he's flying in the air, run under his legs. You should definitely never be being hit by his blizzard projectile. That moves are very easy to dodge. If you're still being hit by that, it's because you're not strafing enough. Okay? So that's going to conclude all of the tips I have for fighting Barioth. Let's go ahead and talk about some pretty reasonable builds that you can put together as a new player in order to easily defeat him. And I think this is probably the other part of the fight that players are finding challenging. You're probably under-equipped for this fight, or your build just doesn't make any sense, so you're not doing any damage. When you're not doing any damage, the fight lasts forever, and eventually Barioth wins. On screen, I'm going to be showing you two very reasonable early game builds, one for the greatsword and one for the hammer. I think those two weapons do really well against Barioth. If you're a brand new player and you're not very familiar with any of the weapons, don't worry. Both the hammer and the greatsword are fairly easy to learn. They don't have the most complicated movesets. And most importantly of all, when you ledge hop with these weapons, you're going to be dealing a lot of mount damage, especially the hammer. I've got the flight decoration in that build. You're going to be dealing a lot of mount damage and getting easy mounts on this monster. So every time you mount him, you can play the mounting minigame and get another knockdown on him. Both of these weapons will do a pretty good job smacking him in the head. The hammer can give you KOs additionally, so it's a little more complicated than the greatsword, but on the other hand, you do get the KOs, so that's an extra knockdown or two in the fight. And in this fight, again, we really value having good crowd control, so that's just another thing to think about. You'll notice we're using the defender weapons from the base game. Those are actually pretty good. Defender weapons, although they do a little less damage than the new Iceborne weapons in the early game, what's really powerful about them is you're getting the health regen augmentations and other augmentations that you might like. For the greatsword, you can go double health regen augmentation if you want. For the hammer, I went with a slot upgrade, and this is because I put a level of vitality in there. That's what gives me room for the flight decoration, which is totally worth it. You can see that the parts I was using for these setups are the Kulu Yaku armor sets. This is a really good armor set for building crit boost and maybe a little bit of crit eye. You can try to get your weakness exploit in there however you can. Maybe you got the charm, maybe you got the decorations, but there's all kinds of wiggle room here. You'll notice I was able to get both health boost and divine blessing together, which is a big deal as well. Those are extremely defensive skills. And putting them together will make it so much harder for Barioth to be able to defeat you. So if you could just get health boost and divine blessing on your setups, maybe eat for feline moxie, when you enter the game, if you just send out an SOS flare to get some help, you probably won't die and use up all your lives anyways. Maybe your teammates will, who knows. Teammates are crazy sometimes. But yeah, you have a very good chance of surviving this fight and really being able to do some really serious damage to Barioth with these setups. And you don't have to use just the greatsword or the hammer. You can use the idea of this armor set, the general idea of it, from a lot of weapons. Not all weapons, obviously not the bow or the dual blades or maybe the bow guns, but many melee weapons are going to be able to take advantage of this setup, okay? And that's going to conclude my combat guide for fighting Barioth. If you found some useful information in here, let me know. And hopefully the footage I provided gave you a lot of terrific examples of exactly what I was talking about, okay? Because that's really important. I want you guys to be able to see what I'm talking about, but also kind of understand the ideas. And this is what's going to give you the skills you need in order to defeat Barioth. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.